Global Oil Outlook Predictions webinar. My name is Shannon Folkin, and I am part of the marketing team here at DTN. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like just to run through a few housekeeping items. First, you'll notice that everyone is muted, and that's just to reduce background noise, but we do encourage you to ask questions, and there will be time at the end to answer those. So please type in those questions in the chat window on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And we will get to as many as we can in the time we have allotted today. Additionally, we'll be sending out an email in a day or two with a link to the rebroadcast. So without further ado, I'd like to Troy Vincent, who is our Senior Energy Market Analyst, who has been part of DTN for over 4 years, and Kareem Bastadi, a Market Analyst who has been with DTN for over 2 years and joins us from Austria. So with that, Troy, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, over to you.
All right, thanks so much. So hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. As Shannon just said, I'm Troy Vincent, and in a moment, you'll hear from my peer, Kareem Bastadi. We have a lot to get covered today, so let's go ahead and jump right in. So let's start by first briefly reflecting on our second half 2023 outlook. And first, let me say that while I do feel like we do some really great work here, even we were a bit surprised by the accuracy of our forecasts in the second half, given that we were taking quite a bit of a counter consensus view and remaining more bearish for the balance of the second half than most in the industry were at the time. Even amid additional geopolitical turmoil in the Middle East and with additional OPEC plus cut announcements over the period that we hadn't baked into our outlook, it was largely the points that we did emphasize looking through the second half, primarily U.S. production growth that surprised most in the market, continued strength in Russian oil exports, weakness in Chinese economic growth, and swelling OPEC spare capacity that really kept the market trading within our trading range despite these geopolitical developments. Lastly, let me point out that we specified a bullish bias in our second half outlook only through September. And if you look at the WTI chart in the background here, you can see that we not only topped out in late September, but we also traded within our expected range for all of the second half except for 12 trading days. And as a reminder, since we'll be revisiting our expected trading range at the end of this webinar, when we specify trading range, that's not really to give like a vague price expectation, but instead to signal where market participants should consider turning bullish or turning bearish as we approach the extremes of this range, which, as you can see here, would have worked out quite nicely if you'd traded the range that way in the second half. So given that we believe that this was by far the most significant development moving through the second half of 2023 and into 2024, let's start the discussion today by focusing on U.S. oil production. In our second half 2023 outlook, we argued that the EIA was, and others for that matter, were massively underestimating U.S. oil production by the tune of around 600,000 barrels per day at the time of our last webinar. In July, the EIA was reporting crude production at 12.2 million barrels per day, but it was clear to us that production was closer to 12.8 million barrels per day, as we stated at the time. In the following weeks and months, the EIA and others acknowledged that production was actually around 12.9 million barrels per day at the time of mid-year, and growing far more rapidly than they or OPEC or really anyone else had expected for the most part. Now, moving into 2023, the EIA had expected just around 460,000 barrels per day of U.S. crude production growth in 2023 compared to 2022. But in reality, U.S. crude production alone averaged 1 million barrels per day, or about 8.5% above 2022 levels throughout 2023. Likewise, OPEC underestimated total U.S. liquids production growth by around 500,000 barrels per day over 2023. And while falling rig counts will inevitably catch up to U.S. production growth in 2024, the chart to the right here really makes clear that U.S. producers are becoming increasingly efficient, and rig counts are really no longer the indicator of future production that they once were. And as such, we believe U.S. crude production growth in moving into 2024 will outpace expectations in the first half, slowing to about 200,000 barrels per day of growth instead of the EIA's expectation of just 90,000 barrels per day of growth. Now, let me go ahead and hand it over to Kareem to talk about another significant supply side factor.
Thank you. Yeah, we saw Russian oil also continue to land on the market, pretty much unhindered. In our last webinar in August, we talked a great deal about the way the sanctions were designed, the aim they had, and how they are actually ineffectual by design, right? Because they prioritize fighting inflation and thus, not trying to choke supply. And one of the reasons why we, mentioned that factor was that the caps were set far above where euros was trading at the time, and so Russia's main crude export wasn't affected at all. And however, now in the second half, with the exception for a few days, euros traded far above that cap, and yet exports continued higher instead of lower. And this is because Russia had ample time to build out a large shadow fleet, of tankers are dedicated to circumvent sanctions, right, and move all that crude to Asia. Now, aside from the ineffectual sanctions, we also had an issue with promised versus delivered cuts from Russia. If we move to the next slide, please. They were, at least in their messaging, they seemed more determined in the second half. There were multiple cut announcements, both production cuts and export cuts. And while you can see on the on the chart on the right that in the second half exports were a tad lower than in the first half of the year, they still failed to deliver on any of the promised export cuts because they were based on July export levels, and every month after July saw higher exports instead of lower ones. Now, on the production side of things, Russia promised a 500,000 barrel cut from the February baseline. We did see that cut partially realized by December, but there's still about 125,000 over target. Now, the latest promise recently was to start cutting in the first quarter. Although with the important detail here that the baseline they are deciding to cut from is the May-June 2023 record high level of exports. And even with that, we so far, from what it looks like so far in January, exports doing well. They're about 150,000 above target. Now, having said all that, we do expect Russian production to decline, but those declines to remain very modest in the first half of next year. And part of the reason is that we saw a lot of exploration and drilling activity in Russia last year. And despite seeing some reports about lower production, Transneft, for example, in their end-of-year report, highlighted how volumes moved through their domestic system were completely unchanged from last year or from 2022. Oh, we had all that Russian crude land on the market, and the same can be said for products. The next slide, please. And it was the same story with the product cap than it was with the crude oil cap, where instead of throttling flows, it just redirected them to elsewhere in the world. In the case of Russian refined products to Middle East, and Middle Eastern products in turn to Europe. Now, in the fall, they introduced an export ban on their refined products. Great deal was made out of this, was seen as very bullish. Were supply concerns, but that never really materialized and was very, very short-lived. And it came right at the time where their refiners were undergoing deep maintenance and domestic supplies were very limited. Now, they couldn't have played this game for very long given the very limited amount of product storage capacity they have. And we have already seen diesel exports rebound since. It wasn't just U.S. production and Russian oil and Russian product. It was non-OPEC production in general. It was a little underestimated last year. That's according to the EIA, non-OPEC liquids production grew around 2.5 million barrels per day last year. And aside from the US, which we just heard about, we also had sizable growth in Brazil and in Iran, and new players like Guyana continuing to increase output. And just in the second half alone, output was around 1.6 million barrels per day higher than the first half. Well, for next year, we do expect production growth to continue, but to slow down sizably compared to the second half. Now, while supply in general seems to have surprised to the upside in 2023, this cannot be said for demand. And for that, I'll hand it over to you, Troy.
So yeah, let's start with China, since it was such a major factor here on the global stage. China's policy pivot away from zero COVID in late 2022, it just continued to fail to propel Chinese equity markets, the yuan, and oil and commodity markets more broadly higher in the second half of 2023 and moving into 2024. At the end of the day, the Chinese Communist Party has had very little success reorientating the Chinese economy towards greater private consumption-led growth. And this just creates significant difficulties for Chinese policymakers when they look for options to try to stimulate growth and demand domestically. We believe that people underestimate the massive drag on the Chinese economy that is the property sector. And as such, we expect China's crumbling property sector will continue to limit any hopes of surging domestic private consumption in the first half of 2024. Now, over the recent holiday period, domestic travel in China returned to pre-COVID levels, and the upcoming Lunar New Year holiday is expected to be the busiest since 2019. Now, while this is obviously good news and supportive of oil demand, it's also a reminder that China has essentially foregone 4 years of travel growth and is just now back to where it was pre-COVID. And while domestic flight capacity is currently up around 11% from 2019 levels, international flight capacity is still down 40% from pre-COVID levels. This carries significant costs to the Chinese economy, but also economies all across Asia that counted on increasing Chinese travel for their countries to, really stimulate growth domestically. Furthermore, for jet fuel demand considerations specifically, less international travel is more important than growing domestic travel, given that long-haul flights around the world are, of course, more fuel intensive. And you can see that this lack of international travel is a serious concern for the Chinese government, given that they've made some really significant policy measures lately to try to encourage travel to China. But in the wake of the CCP's takeover of Hong Kong, their handling of COVID, and generally rising tensions between China and Taiwan and the West more broadly, it's really unlikely that these policy measures will be enough to bring international travel back to pre-COVID levels in the first half of 2024. Now, Chinese crude imports did surge and hit a new record high of 11.3 million barrels per day, up about 11% year on year, with China leaning heavily on sanctioned oil from Russia, as Karim mentioned a moment ago, and Iran. China and Chinese refiners have a very long history of being able to buy the dip, and they can do so in size given their rapidly growing storage and refining capacity. And with this swelling refining capacity comes swelling refined product output. And Chinese customs data show refined fuel exports up about 17% year on year in 2023. This is important when not only considering what the pace of crude imports means in regards to domestic oil consumption in China, but also in regard to refiners in other parts of the world who face growing competition from Chinese fuel supplies. And given that Chinese regulators just unleashed a full year of crude import quotas at the start of the year, instead of trickling small quotas out throughout the calendar year as they typically do, and given recent low prices for crude and the expectation of a tightening oil market in Q1, we expect the Chinese crude imports are going to rebound from their lows in November following this latest round of crude import and product export quotas. However, we want to continue to emphasize, much as we did moving through the second half of last year, the importance of tracking or attempting to track at the very, very least how much of this oil is consumed in China rather than being stored or re-exported as product. All right, now I'm going to turn it back over to Karim to tell us what these developments have led to.
Thank you. Yeah, all this, surprise supply, if you will, and that, demand growth trading expectations really forced OPEC to production discipline and to show, on top of that, shoulder additional cuts in order to defend price. Because, with all that non-OPEC production growth, we saw throughout all of last year, global stocks of, combined stocks of product and crude, I should say, continue to build. OECD commercial oil inventories, for example, grew 3% last year. And according to the EIA, we had about more than 500,000 barrel per day growth in global petroleum liquid stocks just in the fourth quarter. Now, to the cuts. In the second half of last year, if you move to the next slide, please. In the second half, we did see more production discipline from OPEC. We did see them throttling production and exports, although in the second half, Saudi exports re-emerged. However, this is not a sign of lacking production discipline, and just due to the fact that these are barrels freed up that are being used domestically in summer for power generation. And throughout all of that last year, actually, not just through the second half, we had repeated rhetoric and repeated cut announcements, and they all led to very brief and very small price rallies, with prices ultimately returning to where they started. It seems that with OPEC intervention seems to have lost some of its bite, at least compared to a few years ago. And that's just one of many dilemmas actually OPEC is facing at the moment. We had in early November, we had Abdulaziz bin Salman, the energy minister, again brush off concerns about oversupplied market and repeat his comments about the alleged and the fundamental market and the paper market being completely disconnected and so on. And just days later, OPEC Plus raised the voluntary cuts to 2.2 million barrels per day. So that it makes sense given that the market seems increasingly numb to this messaging from OPEC. Now, there's also, of course, with what just happened with Angola quitting, the bearish risk of an OPEC divide, because the longer they're in a position where they're forced to adhere to those cuts or to shoulder additional cuts, the higher the risk of countries that can't afford to stay the course leaving. And of course, then there is the ongoing issue of ever-growing spare capacity. Now, if you think back to 2022, the lack of spare capacity was a major bullish factor for oil, and with now this really long round of cuts, spare capacity really shot up, rocketed to more than 4 million according to EIA, more than 5 according to the IEA, million barrels per day, growing. So what formerly was a bullish risk factor now is just a comfortable cushion to any supply side risks. The impact on prices in general might have been negligible, but there was actually a measurable impact from these OPEC cuts, and that was on crude quality spreads and on the price of sours versus sweets. And of course, with OPEC Plus cutting all that sour crude, we did see that the market tightened considerably. At the same time, right, that this has happened, we had 2.5 million barrels per day of growth of mostly light and sweet oil, and increasing that imbalance. And with that global slate shifting, just a little lighter and a little sweeter, this should be interpreted as bullish for diesel. And one more impact of these crude quality spreads and this mismatch is that looking at any crack spread, using TI or Brent, will imply a much higher refining margin. That is probably actually the case. Now, on to the geopolitical risks. The question how much they matter given the ample spare capacity. And as you can tell, they're not all bullish risks, right? Since March of last year, we have more than 400,000 barrels per day of Kurdish oil being partially offline, and all of it being barred from the export market. At the same time, we have the ongoing force majeure in Libya on its largest oil fields that are shut in because of protests. They're bound to resume at some point. I should mention that we don't believe the Kurdish oil to the pipe to start flowing to Ceyhan in Turkey again anytime soon. This is an ongoing dispute with no resolution in sight at the moment. And of course, with the relaxation of sanctions on Venezuela in November, there's some potential for increased exports from there. There are also concerns, of course, with the ongoing conflict in the Middle East for that to spread. Although there are no indications at the moment that carrying a great deal of risk. And finally, the one thing we want to bring to your attention, because it's been in the news constantly over those past few weeks, was the escalation in the Red Sea and the Houthi rocket attacks on merchant vessels there. Thank you. So very recently, tankers were not targeted. It was container ships and container freight that we started to see divert route. When it comes to the question of oil, how much does it matter for oil? And so, first of all, what is affected? About half of volumes, almost, are Russian oil being exported toward Asia, and the Russians have shown no indication, no sign of rerouting at all yet. Probably partly because they're not actively being targeted. If anything, the impact on oil, barring a major escalation, of course, the impact on oil should be very modest, right? In the near term, because of longer voyage, right? You might have refiners scrambling to secure supplies in short term, which will boost demand on the spot market. And if the new route around Africa really takes hold, then we should see some increased demand in bunker fuel. But like I said, aside from any major escalation, we don't attribute a great deal of a bullish factor to that. Now, let's move on to all these supply concerns to economic concerns surrounding demand. I'll hand it back to Troy.
So yeah, now we're going to spend some time kind of discussing the interplay between the economy and oil. So, U.S. oil production ultimately was the only thing that was surprisingly strong in 2023. U.S. GDP and employment held up far better than we and most economists had expected in 2023, while inflation continued to trend lower amid higher interest rates. And despite rate hikes, given expansionary fiscal policy over the past year working its way into real economic activity like factory and infrastructure construction, and given the U.S. has extremely high levels of fixed rate debts compared to both U.S. history and the rest of the world, and given the willingness of individuals in the U.S. to spend down their savings and accrue debt, we've so far avoided recession. As you can see on the chart to the right, gasoline prices do remain key to U.S. consumer confidence, which influences their ability and willingness to go out and spend elsewhere. And the inverse correlation has been clear over many years. And in December, consumer confidence jumped higher clearly as U.S. retail gasoline prices hit their lowest since 2021. All that said, U.S. gasoline demand did continue to disappoint this year compared to pre-COVID levels, despite the relatively resilient economy. While U.S. gasoline demand was up 1.5% year on year in 2023, it remained 4% below 2019 levels. While gasoline demand was once thought to be fairly inelastic, the past 2 years has shown that higher prices do indeed lead demand lower, and lower prices lead demand higher. Just not as high as it used to be. And the rise, why is that? Well, the rise in work from home and post-COVID has ultimately proven quite sticky. And we believe that will serve as a fairly indefinite headwind for U.S. gasoline demand going forward. And when you combine that with rising fuel efficiency, rising numbers of EVs and hybrids hitting the road, this keeps gasoline demand at bay. And as you'll see in a moment, gasoline demand staged a relative recovery compared to diesel demand in 2023, and we expect will continue to do so in the first half of 2024. So while the labor market, consumer services, GDP, while they've all proven resilient, and while there has been pronounced strength in manufacturing facility construction in the wake of fiscal stimulus, the same just simply cannot be said for manufacturing and industrial activity in the U.S. Importantly, the most energy intensive sectors of our economy have been in contraction for over a year now. And recently, the ISM manufacturing PMI registered its 14th straight month of contraction in December. Ultimately, the US and OECD more broadly is seeing manufacturing and industrial activity contract, which is weighing on diesel, naphtha, and natural gas demand. Now, taking a look at distillate fuel oil demand, this impact is evident that I just described as far as to the most energy intensive and industrial, part of the economy, because distillate fuel oil demand has averaged 2% below 2022 levels. 2023 levels, and 6% lower compared to pre-COVID. So, as mentioned earlier, unlike gasoline demand, diesel demand couldn't even recover amid lower prices. Now, while a combination of the harvest season, anticipatory heating oil purchases, and pre-holiday freight activity picked up as we had expected in early Q4 of 2023, ultimately we saw an early seasonal peak for distillate fuel oil demand, just as we did last year. And in fact, the peak came even a little bit earlier in the season. Now, with economic growth expected to slow moving into 2024 in the U.S., and with El Nino likely to keep the Northeast U.S., which is really the only region of the country left still utilizing heating oil, distillate demand should continue to disappoint in the first half of 2024. Now, despite the weakness in distillate and gasoline demand compared to pre-COVID levels in the second half of 2023, U.S. refined product stocks continued to hold below historic norms and support crack spreads for most of the second half. So what explains this? Well, largely the same thing that's impacted U.S. fuel stocks over the past 2 years, primarily lower refining capacity, weather disruptions, strong net exports, and repeated deep and lengthy refinery maintenance that we've seen for multiple seasons that we saw repeated this fall. You can see the serious impact in the red ellipses here that winter weather disruptions has had on refining activity and product stocks as well in the past 2 winters. Oh, sorry. Just to mention this as well, because we did make a strong recovery right at the end of the fourth quarter moving into 2024. So, as you'll see on the next slide in just a moment, normalizing U.S. refining activity in just the past few weeks really has caused fuel stocks in the U.S. to make a significant rebound moving into 2024. U.S. gasoline stocks are now their highest since February 2022 and are their highest for the seasonal period since the first week of 2020 at around 245 million barrels. U.S. distillate fuel oil stocks are currently their highest since September of 2021 and are their highest for the seasonal period since January of 2021 at just over 132 million barrels. As mentioned just a moment ago, unplanned outages from last winter weighed on refining activity for much of 2023 after shutting in over 1 million barrels per day of Gulf Coast refining capacity that lingered throughout the spring and really caused, complications and weaker refinery runs well into summer. And then, just as refiners were kind of set to run as hard as possible moving through peak demand season in the summer, extreme summer heat led to a new round of unplanned outages, causing Gulf Coast refinery runs to head lower at like the peak demand season, right, moving into the July 4th and surrounding the holiday period there in the middle of the summer. And that led Gulf Coast refinery runs, for example, about 400,000 barrels per day lower year on year, even though refinery capacity in the region was up 250,000 barrels per day year on year. Now, without these unplanned outages, largely weather disrupted, U.S. and global product inventories, of course, would look much different today than they do. And as you can see in the refinery utilization chart here to the right, refinery maintenance this fall was both deep and lengthy, and refinery utilization was still below 90% moving into December. However, like I said a moment ago, after back-to-back seasons of lengthy maintenance, and when combined with Gulf Coast refiners having access to cheap U.S. natural gas, which should make their margins relatively strong compared to others in the Atlantic Basin, we believe U.S. refinery runs will average at least 200 to 250,000 barrels per day higher year on year in the first half of 2024. Now, the record pace of domestic crude production and these refinery disruptions in 2023 allowed for stronger U.S. crude exports than would have otherwise been expected. Averaging around 4.1 million barrels per day in 2023, U.S. crude exports were up nearly 15%, or around 500,000 barrels per day year on year. And net exports of petroleum products in 2023, thanks in large part to strength in NGL production, averaged nearly 4.1 million barrels per day, or about 5%, or 200,000 barrels per day higher year on year from what was already a new record strong pace back in 2022. And while we continue to expect that both crude and product exports will remain extremely strong in 2024, slowing domestic crude production growth, export capacity limitations, and growing competition in the product market will mean we shouldn't expect the same type of growth to continue. Now, speaking of growing competition in the product export market, let's move on to discuss some midstream and downstream expansions here in the coming that we're facing here in the coming months. So first on the list is Nigeria's Dangote refinery, which is the world's largest single train oil refinery. And it was inaugurated back in May of last year after facing years of delays. But recently, after receiving about 6 million barrels of Nigerian crude in recent weeks, test runs have begun, and Dangote hopes to soon run around 350,000 barrels per day of crude before getting up to capacity later this year. You know, the Nigerian National Petroleum Company recently said it would end the importation of refined petroleum products by the end of 2024, as all of the country's refineries are hopeful to be operational by that time, and Dangote is hopeful to be up and fully operational. However, we have to preface this by saying, or add the caveat that in late 2022, they had expected to stop imports by late 2023. So this keeps getting pushed back. However, we do believe that this will be at least partially realized, and this will have very serious implications, not only for the Nigerian economy, as it will hopefully move the largest importer of refined products in Africa to a net exporter at some point later this year or early 2025, which will save the Nigerian economy and central bank there around $30 billion of foreign exchange reserves annually, and thereby support Nigeria's currency. But it'll also have extremely serious implications for other refiners in the Atlantic Basin, particularly Northwest European refiners, who will need to find a new home or new buyers for their product. Now, we're also seeing refinery capacity expansion that we should see materialize here in the coming months in Mexico. In Mexico, the new Olmeca refinery has been President AMLO's signature project that he's been working on for years. But much like Dangote has seen, these consistent production delays and rising costs, the same can be said for the Olmeca refinery. That said, if fully operational in 2024, it would increase Mexico's refinery throughput by about 40% from 2023 levels. And much like Nigeria, Mexico hopes to stop importing gasoline and diesel this year, something that they had hoped would happen about a year ago. Now, once again, although we're skeptical that these hopes are going to be fully realized, particularly in the first half of the year, even if these aspirations are just mostly realized, this will mean losing the top buyer by far of U.S. gasoline. And in turn, as Mexico utilizes more of their domestic crude for refining at home, it'll mean U.S. refiners will lose out on access to what is now their second largest source of imported crude oil. Now, turning to our neighbor to the north in Canada, they've been working to get more of their landlocked crude in Alberta to the global market. The pipeline expansion would take the pipeline all the way from Alberta to a shipping terminal near Vancouver. And this is incredibly important for U.S. refiners, given that U.S. imports of Canadian crude averaged about 3.8 million barrels per day in 2023. And that's about 60% of our total imports. As such, Canada is by far our largest source of imported crude, particularly of the heavy sour variety that the Gulf Coast refiners need, and as Kareem mentioned earlier, that OPEC Plus producers are cutting back on. Now, with line fill on the pipeline expected to begin later this quarter, Midwest and Gulf Coast refiners will face growing competition and narrowing discounts for Canadian crude as we move through the first half of 2024. All right, so now we're going to leave you, kind of shift gears here a little bit, leave you with a few thoughts on the impact of winter weather on oil and gas markets and the economic outlook before we conclude. So, although currently much of the country is experiencing a polar vortex-inspired deep freeze that have, caused some serious complications, weather patterns in the second half of 2023 and so far this winter have largely been El Nino inspired. And this fall, what that meant was that El Nino helped prevent any hurricane damage at oil and gas infrastructure along the Gulf Coast. And so far this winter, El Nino has limited heating oil demand in the Northeast U.S. Above average temps have also kept Henry Hub natural gas futures from breaking out higher. Prices at the U.S. hub are now down about 15% year on year at around $2.80 an MMBTU. And we're keeping a close eye on the current deep freeze that, has hit much of the country. We acknowledge that it shut in significant volumes, now reported somewhere around 750,000 barrels per day of crude production in North Dakota, also taking off significant natural gas production there as well. At the same time, we're also seeing export delays and refinery disruptions. And this limits crude throughput at domestic refiners. However, unlike the past two winters, we're just not seeing any reports as of yet, and I must, once again add that caveat, that suggests that there's going to be long-term damage to either crude production or refining capacity. And it's important to remember that while production and runs are currently suffering, domestic fuel demand, both gasoline and diesel, and oil exports are suffering as well. And that really helps counterbalance the bullish impact, from the production side in the field. Also, want to mention, you can see to the right-hand side here, the DTN Frontier Weather 11 to 15-day forecast is looking like a return to well above average temperatures as we close out the month of January. And that should be a welcome relief to everyone in the industry and help get that North Dakota oil and gas flowing once again. Now, if we look over across the pond in Europe, the EU entered winter with storage capacity for natural gas around 99% full, which is a record level. And current storage levels are still extremely strong at around 79% full. Just for reference, when prices were shooting higher in 2022, storage was just about 44% full for this time of year. Now, so far this winter, much like the US, Europe has seen heating degree days 20% below the 30-year average and around 6% below last winter. At the same time, European industrial demand has made a bit of a recovery from its 2022 lows, but still remains around 20% below Russian invasion levels. And, with prices still nearly 3 times higher than they were pre-COVID, prices still have a ways to fall before they're going to really inspire a true return of industrial activity across Europe. We expect that European storage of natural gas is going to end the heating season around 55% full, which suggests that there's very limited upside potential for natural gas prices for the remainder of this winter, particularly given that we're seeing the forecast skew well above average once again across Europe moving through the second half of January. All right, now let's get back to economics for a moment, since we think this is going to be really pivotal in the coming months before we conclude. So in recent weeks, most economists have kind of fully written off a recession this year. At the same time, however, many leading indicators still suggest that a U.S. recession is likely. But we got to, have to point out that so far those indicators have been proven unreliable this cycle. Now, while we believe that there is still a small risk of recession, given the number of historical indicators pointing that direction, what we can say is that truly unprecedented series of events that we've seen, really since 2020 has likely rendered many of these previously very reliable forward indicators just unfortunately more unreliable this time around. And although we do believe that we will avoid recession, it's still incredibly important to acknowledge that U.S. growth is turning lower amid a slowing fiscal impulse and what we believe will be interest rate cuts that don't really materialize until closer to mid-year, and particularly given the recent inflationary pressures from global shipping that we mentioned a bit ago. Now, if rate cuts from the Federal Reserve do come sooner in the first half, well, that likely just signals that the economy is slowing more rapidly than expected, and that it might be more of a bumpy rather than a soft landing. Now, looking kind of at zooming out, looking at the global level, global economic growth is expected to slow to 2.6% in 2024 from around 3.2% in 2023, amid both slowing US and Chinese economies and continued stagnant European economy. Chinese goods, the exports of Chinese goods, I should say, did rise for the first time in 7 months in November, but demand for Chinese goods is expected to continue to suffer moving into 2024, particularly through the first half, after making the first year of an annual decline in exports of total Chinese goods exports since 2016 and 2023. Now, if we want to look at demand growth expectations in specific as they relate to the global economy, well, we need to think about kind of what's happening in the wake of ongoing trade wars and now hot wars, of course, and largely that is global economic fragmentation, and that's expected to continue to prove increasingly costly as we move through 2024. Now, as I say here, global oil demand growth is expected to reflect this reality by growing at around half the rate of last year. And importantly, although global oil demand has surpassed pre-COVID levels, much like the chart to the right, or much like global GDP, oil demand is not recovering to its pre-COVID trend. So really, what does all this mean that we've laid out for you today?
I mean, to summarize, right? If you want to take one thing away from this, it's really that at least in the first quarter, we are expecting the market to be undersupplied because of the continued OPEC cuts. As Chinese imports are picking up, and non-OPEC production growth slows down. However, the slowing global economy, Troy just alluded to, will likely limit that upside. And we wanted to highlight that there's a real possibility for U.S. stocks at some point to experience builds while globally inventories continue to draw. Now, in other words, right, you have the largest, most transparent market with weekly data updates, almost real time. See builds on much more hard to see through markets. See draws, and this also could be a limiting factor to the upside. To our concrete expectations.
Yeah, so just to kind of put it in price terms now, since we've talked about the the kind of logistical considerations and what's likely to affect various parts of upstream, midstream, downstream, just to focus in on the price expectations. Well, we expect that benchmark prices, so talking primarily WTI and Brent here, of course, to remain largely range bound in the first half of 2024, with a bullish bias through early Q2. We expect that gasoline prices are currently near their lows for the first half, and the diesel prices are going to follow much of the same path moving through the first quarter. However, as we work through the first half and a slowing global economy is realized and seasonal diesel demand, for example, moves lower, we believe that diesel prices will move toward parity with gasoline. And while geopolitical uncertainty certainly looms large, we must leave you with more or less the same message that we left you with actually moving into the second half of 2023, which is that a managed market supply deficit is simply not the same as an organic supply deficit. So, given that the tightness that we're expecting in Q1 is created by OPEC increasing spare production capacity rather than this being a matter of underinvestment in the oil sector, leading oil production to fail to keep up with consumption, this is going to continue to limit the upside price potentials for bullish tail risks, for example, like a major war or some escalation, and that's going to continue as we move through 2024, and that's going to be compounded as well by what's expected to be a slowing global economy and continued record non-OPEC production. So that's really all we have for you today. If you have any questions for us, of course, we'll try to get to what we can here today, but also you can email us directly here and feel free to follow these links for more information. Hand it back to you, Shannon.
Perfect. All right, thanks guys. That was a lot of great information. As Troy mentioned, if you do have questions, please type them in the chat window. And if you're looking for more insights from them, you can check out our dtn.com website or our ProfitX or Refined Fuels demand product pages. And as a reminder, we will be sending out a post-webinar email with a link to the rebroadcast. So I do have a few here. And I don't know, Troy or Kareem, I'll let you all decide who's best to answer. But if Red Sea disruptions aren't that significant for oil prices, why is there such a big deal being made of the events there?
You can start that, Kareem. I'll pitch in if needed.
Sure. Yeah, I can. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not completely negligible, the impact, right? But the impact, that's what we tried to highlight earlier, was mostly on the shipping of like container freight, not on tankers. Of course, that has recently changed, right? Also to reiterate that the Russians don't seem very deterred at the moment. It can have definitely a sizable impact on international trade, on Asian goods moving to Europe. But in terms of concrete impact on let's say oil supply from the region, that just doesn't, barring a major escalation, just doesn't seem very likely at the moment. However, on the Russian part, I think the one tanker that was hit so far, incidentally, was a tanker carrying Russian oil. But I think that was a mistake. Right?
Yeah, that was one of those shadow fleet vessels that was previously, I believe, a UK owned vessel, and you can understand the potential confusion there. But yeah, no, I think to Kareem's point earlier in the presentation, it can create a short-term headache. Let's say you're a refiner in Northwest Europe that was counting on a delivery that was expected to come through the Red Sea. Well, then you could expect, a couple of weeks delay on the delivery there, which could lead to a scramble for, supply in the very short term. But I think one reason, that the market is going to shrug this off longer term, as long as there's no serious escalation, like, for example, leads to a blockade at the Strait of Hormuz or something like that. As long as it remains to the Red Sea and more or less in line with what we're currently seeing, well, then once all of the vessels reroute and that becomes a normal trade flow pattern, then it will only take a couple of weeks really to kind of let that supply play out and make it to its destination. And then from that point on, everybody will know, right? Well, we need to count on that taking another 10 days or something on the voyage. And once that's built into your supply expectations, then it's no longer really disruptive. It of course adds additional costs, as Kareem said earlier. It adds some additional bunker fuel demand, but not really changing the supply-demand balance globally.
Great, thank you. We have another question here. If Mexico increases their ability to refine their own crude, where do you see the U.S. outletting refined product to, and also who would they go to replace those gallons of crude imported?
Okay, so I'll take the first stab at this. Feel free to weigh in, of course, Kareem. So where will it go? Well, it's going to look for homes elsewhere in Latin America. It's given that's still a primary destination for particularly U.S. Gulf Coast refined product. So it's going to be looking for new homes or additional volumes in homes that it currently already goes to. Also, it's going to work its way, really just around the world. As I said earlier, U.S. refiners, because they, particularly along the Gulf Coast, have some kind of relatively optimistic economics compared to, say, Northwest European refiners, they're going to be kind of the last to capitulate. So in that regard, U.S. Product is likely to kind of push out some or kind of grab some market share from Northwest European refiners, for example, as we move through the year. And ultimately, this is why, as I kind of started the presentation with the increased exports out of China, it's also why that's an important component, because as the U.S. refiners are looking to send more product abroad, well, there are other sources that are looking to do the same thing. So it's going to increase competition there. And if this plays out as expected, likely diminish margins broadly. And as the question as to where will the Gulf Coast get that crude, that additional crude to kind of backfill, and this, I guess, really applies to both Mexican crude as well as Canadian crude. Well, first and foremost, I think when it comes to Gulf Coast refiners, once again, that this is, and I don't want to say it's the reason, but it is a reason that the loosening of sanctions on Venezuela is so important. And the timing probably isn't entirely coincidental, in that, prior to Russian sanctions, the U.S. imported fuel oil and very high sulfur, low quality product that we would run in refiners along the Gulf Coast, and so that's no longer an option. And prior to that, we were importing very sizable volumes of Venezuelan heavy sour, and that was something that the Gulf Coast refiners really depended upon. So we believe that much of this increase in Venezuelan production that is expected to be seen over the first half of this year is likely destined for Gulf Coast refiners.
Yeah, I think generally European refiners will have a harder time dealing with Dangote and finding another outlet for their gasoline than Gulf Coast refiners will have to find other markets in Middle and South America. And part of the reason definitely is their advantageous setup in the sense that their production costs and the access to cheap natural gas are much lower.
Yeah, and I might add, right, this is one of the reasons that the slowing global economy and the weakness in developed economies, the strength in the U.S. dollar, it's a reason that all of these things are so important and matter so much, because these are the outlets for, if you're a Gulf Coast refiner, and you're seeing increased competition on the global marketplace for refined products, well, then you really need that part of the economy. You really need that developing economy sector of the global economy to be performing really well, so that you have hopes of demand growth expectations and can see your market share grow in those regions or in those countries. And that's, once again, that's another reason that the outlook for the global economy being what it is so important.
Great. Thank you, guys. We're getting close to the top of the hour, so I wanna wrap up and thank everybody for joining today. And we've gotten some requests for slides, so we will include that in the post email along with the rebroadcast link. And we hope everybody has a great day. Thanks again, Kareem and Troy. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.